Hello, my name is Katherine Burley. I am a fourth-year student at the University of Manitoba in the Global Political Economy program, and today I'm going to be discussing the research and the results of my fourth-year research paper on interest group politics, a political contest of Canadian business versus labor interest groups since 1980. With that being said, let's get started. The research question that I am attempting to answer is, to what extent have interest groups representing labor been able to balance the influence of interest groups representing business in three key issue areas: tax policy, deficit reduction, and trade policy in Canada since 1980? And then the second part of this question is, has their ability to do so changed from the early 1980s to the present? There are two key theoretical frameworks that are broad and contrasting that help to try and explain the role of the state and specifically its interaction with interest group pressures. The first is the pluralist school, which says that an array of groups holds power in politics, all of whom are allowed to compete for governmental benefits fairly on an equal playing field, meaning that none hold a distinct advantage over the others. In contrast, the second class-based explanation says that yes, many different types of interest groups exist, but their influence is certainly not equal, but instead the capitalist class is in the best position to influence the outcomes of the political process because it is the class that controls surplus value. Moving from theoretical considerations into my research and methods, I employ a historical analysis of two types of documents in order to answer my question. The first is the reports of the Business Council of Canada, BCC, and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, CCPA, on tax policy, deficit reduction, and trade policy. Then specifically for each issue area and for each interest group, I select one sample report from the 1980s and one from the past decade, meaning that my total sample comprises 12 reports. The second type of document are the major pieces of tax reform legislation passed, deficit reduction or spending initiatives fulfilled, mostly at the federal level, and trade agreements signed by Canada since 1980. Keeping my methods in mind, let's move to the results that I have found. So all of the results that I'm about to discuss are based on the preferences expressed by the BCC and CCPA in these 12 sample reports, which I've listed below on my three chosen issue areas of interest. Looking first at tax policy in the 1980s. In this decade, the BCC, their primary goals were a lower personal income tax rates, not to exceed 35% on the highest incomes once accounting for both federal and provincial taxes, a lower flat corporate tax rate, a broadened tax base which they wanted to achieve by limiting tax expenditures, greater neutrality on the ways in which corporations were taxed, and the implementation of a new comprehensive transaction tax, which would become the GST. The CCPA goals, in contrast, were higher personal income tax rates, the addition of a tax on wealth above a certain amount, a higher flat corporate tax rate, which would become 60% for those corporations earning over $100,000, no preference to be placed on capital gains taxes, the abolition of the dividend tax credit, less or no reliance on the federal sales tax in order to raise government revenues because the CCPA viewed this tax as inherently regressive. What happened in terms of policy? In this decade, the maximum personal and corporate tax rates were lowered, the tax base was broadened, there was a cap placed on the lifetime capital gains exemption, the dividend tax credit was lowered, and the GST was adopted. As we can see from these two tables, the first of which depicts the BCC's preferences, and then the second of which depicts the CCPA's preferences, many more of the proposed policies by the BCC were adopted in the 1980s than by the CCPA. Looking specifically at the top marginal tax rate on personal income taxes and on the flat corporate tax rate, we can see that in the 1980s, both declined substantially. Moving from the 1980s to the 2010s, the BCC and CCPA's goals both remained relatively consistent. The BCC's primary goals in the 2010s were to lower the federal flat corporate tax rate from 15% to 13%, to broaden the tax base by restricting accelerated depreciation and resource deductions, by reining in investment tax credits, and by having the small business deduction, to lower and make uniform the provincial flat corporate tax rate at 10%, and to harmonize all of the provinces that still had a PST with the GST. The CCPA goals, on the other hand, were a higher flat corporate tax rate, higher top income tax rate, the addition of at least one new high income tax bracket to broaden the tax base, to scale down or eliminate tax deductions, to rely less on the GST, a new wealth and inheritance tax, to rely more on specific consumption taxes rather than the GST, such as on carbon, and to implement a basic income for all Canadians. What policies have been enacted in the 2010s? A new high income tax bracket was added, imposing a 33% marginal tax for income over $200,000, reduced access to small business deduction, the implementation of a carbon tax, and a federal corporate tax that was last reduced in 2012 from 16.5% to 15%, and that has remained unchanged since. What we can see comparing these tables to the ones from the 1980s is that substantially more of the proposals suggested by the CCPA have been implemented than were in the 1980s, especially compared to the dominance that was seen by business on public policy in the 1980s. Further, in terms of personal and corporate income tax rates, both declined substantially throughout most of this period, but the top personal income tax rate has increased in recent years, while the corporate income tax rate has remained stagnant. Moving into our second issue area, deficit reduction. In the 1980s, the BCC wanted the deficit, especially the federal deficit, swiftly reduced, not necessarily by increasing taxes, but instead by significantly decreasing government program expenditures, such as in the economic development and social affairs envelopes. In contrast, the CCPA goal did not see deficit reduction as a valuable target in and of itself, but instead it wanted to reduce interest rates, to lower taxes on low and middle income Canadians, to place higher taxes on the highest income earners, and to implement stimulative, labor-intensive programs which actually required government spending. What happened in the 1980s? The federal government steadily reduced its deficits from the 1984-85 fiscal year to the 1988-89 fiscal year. While these did increase in the early 1990s, primarily as a result of the 1991-92 recession, the deficit was completely eliminated by the 1997-98 fiscal year, as can be seen in this chart. What is also noticeable is that from this chart, which depicts federal government program expenditures, the deficit in the 1980s and 1990s appears to have mainly been reduced thanks to a sharp decline in federal government program expenditures. Moving to the 2010s, the most recent decade, the BCC very much still wanted to rein in federal deficit spending in order to put Canada in the best position when the next economic shock hit, while the CCPA goals saw deficit reduction as far less urgent in order to avoid further cuts to federal government employment and public services. What has happened in the past decade? In contrast to the 1980s, there's actually been an overall upward trend in federal deficit since the election of Justin Trudeau in 2015, as can be seen in this table. And also, federal program expenditures have also seen a sharp increase in recent years. And moving finally from deficit reduction to our final policy area of interest, trade policy. The BCC's primary goal in the 1980s was to pursue trade liberalization and negotiate a comprehensive bilateral agreement between Canada and the US, while the CCPA did not want to sign a free trade agreement with the US and instead prioritize an economic development strategy centered on self-reliance. What happened? The Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1987 and came into effect at the beginning of 1989, which significantly liberalized trade. Here we can see a timeline of those events. Turning to trade policy in the 2010s, the hot button topic was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The BCC's goal was for Canada to sign on to the TPP in order to give Canada free access to new and larger markets, while the CCPA's goal was to have Canada not sign on to the TPP in order to avoid exacerbating Canada's trade deficit with Asian countries, as well as a series of other negative consequences in its view. What happened? The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which became the CPTPP, was ratified in 2018 by Canada and a list of other countries, including Australia and Japan. And here is just another timeline of those events. And finally, some concluding remarks and discussion about what's happened since 1980. In terms of tax policy, business appeared dominant in the 1980s, but Labour has actually seen more of their preferred policies enacted in the last decade. Not enough to make them seem as though they're a dominant class, but certainly their opinion seems to be taken more seriously than it did in the past. In terms of deficit reduction, business appeared dominant in the 1980s and 90s as well, but in more recent years, Labour has seen its concerns addressed more seriously, with the Trudeau and government embracing deficit spending. And finally, in terms of trade policy, business appeared dominant in the 1980s and has continued to see its recommendations come to fruition in the last decade, with both the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement being passed in the 1980s and the CPTPP being ratified in 2018. So on 2 out of 3 of these issue areas, it appears as though Labour has gained some amount of traction with political elected officials in recent years, but on trade policy, business still appears to be dominant. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. I very much appreciate it, and thank you. Have a great day.